Great. Thanks so much to everyone for joining us here today to celebrate Jake Nabel's first book, The Arsacids of Rome, Misunderstanding in Roman-Parthian Relations, with the University of California Press in the series Iran and the Ancient World. And just to let everybody know up front, we'll try to aim to quit at 2:15 because we know people have classes at 2:30. Welcome to everyone in person and over Zoom, and especially welcome to Professor Rahim Shayegan of UCLA, who is joining us over Zoom to give a response after Jake tells us a bit about his book. Professor Shayegan's full title is Professor of Iranian and the Ancient Near East, the Jahangir and Eleanor Amozegar Chair of Iranian, the founding director of the Portavood Institute for the Study of the Iranian World, and the Yarshater, and apologize if I'm mispronouncing names, Center for the Study of Iranian Literary Traditions, and the founder and chair of the governance board of the Global Antiquity Institute at UCLA. So we're very, very happy to have you here, Rahim, and I'll let Jake say more words about you, but he said your title was very long and I had better write it down and say it. So there we go. Welcome again to everyone. Jake Nabel is Tom Bro's early career professor of classical studies and assistant professor of classics and ancient Mediterranean studies. He earned his BA from Bard College and his PhD in classics from Cornell University in 2017. After completing his PhD, he spent 1 year at the Getty Research Institute as a postdoctoral fellow, and then a year as a lecturer in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Cultures at UCLA. During this time, he also held the position of research associate at UCLA's Portavood Center for the Study of the Iranian World. He has been at Penn State here with us since 2019, and he is a beloved professor to many students, some of whom are here today. Jake is a historian of ancient Rome and its relations with the empires of pre-Islamic Iran. Among his awards are a Loeb Classical Library Foundation Fellowship and a Center for Hellenic Studies residency. He also serves as an advisory board member of Encyclopedia Iranica. Jake's book investigates Rome and its relations with Parthia, the two major imperial powers of the ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern sphere 2,000 years ago. His book focuses on a group of princes from the Arsacid family who were sent to live at the Roman court, and it investigates how they were perceived by each side in a political strategy of creative or pragmatic misunderstanding in order to smooth diplomatic and interstate relations. This work requires a re-evaluation of classical literary sources and the utilization of Near Eastern sources, and Jake will tell us more about this. He's much better equipped to do that. But I'll end by saying that advanced reviews describe his book as a significant advance in both Roman and ancient Iranian history. This is from Matthew Canepa. Another description is that it is a bold new vision of Parthian and Roman relations at the dawn of the first millennium. This is from John Godel, and is described as an innovative, timely, and impressive volume by Nikolaus Overtoom. Jake.
Thanks very much, Tony, for introducing me and for moderating today. I'll send the book around.
You assume I'll pass it along and I'll just put it
and pocket it right there. Well, thanks again. Thank you all so much for coming, whether in person or on Zoom. It really means so much. The most important thing that I have to say about the book today is just how thankful I am to so many people here at Penn State, at UCLA, and many other places besides, without whose help the book would never have been written, or at any rate, it might not really be very good. I had always heard that books, even single author monographs, are really the productions of the communities that nourish and sustain and support the scholars whose names end up on the front cover of the book. And I think I can say now this is really the case. And without my friends and my colleagues and my students here in the CAMS department at Penn State, without my friends and colleagues at the Portavood Institute for the Study of the Iranian World at UCLA, without many scholars the world over, the book just simply wouldn't have made it over the finish line. And certainly I wouldn't have had the insight into the material that I needed to make the book, hopefully a study that will move the needle in its field of ancient history and hopefully advance the conversation a little bit. So really to more people than I can possibly thank right now, thank you. There's no book without you. And there's no one of whom this is more true than Professor Shayegan, who is the series editor among his many other titles. He's the series editor of Iran and the Ancient World, the University of California Press series in which this book appears. So to Rahim, endless gratitude to you for being a source of inspiration and support for so many years now. I'm really endlessly in your debt, and I'm very proud that the book could appear in your series. So thank you for being with me today. Okay, let me tell you a bit about the book. What I'm not going to do is rehearse in detail every piece of evidence that's analyzed in the pages of the book. What I would just like to give you a sense of in a relatively short amount of time is the main argument of the book, and then the kinds of evidence that that argument rests upon. And mostly what I look forward to is Rahim's comments and to Q&A as well. So I'll dive in. The book is a study of foreign relations. It's about interstate affairs in the ancient world between two ancient empires. One of these was the Roman Empire, which you see on the left-hand side of the slide, in the Mediterranean, familiar terrain for many ancient historians. The other ancient empire is not such familiar terrain, even for specialists in pre-Islamic Iranian history. The other empire was the Parthian Empire of pre-Islamic Iran. And you're seeing that on the right in various shades of red and orange and yellow. Parthia was actually around for longer than any other pre-Islamic Iranian empire. It was founded in 248 BCE, and it lasted until 224 CE, so a period of almost 500 years when it was the preeminent political power in the ancient Near East. Now, more specifically, the book is about a moment in time when the Arsacid kings, so these are the kings, the dynasty that ruled over the Parthian Empire, when those kings began to send their children, in most cases their sons, but sometimes women of the dynasty went as well, to live at the court of the Roman emperor in the West, within the city of Rome and in Italy. I have tabulated those transfers on the slide for you here. And you can see really the only important data to take away here is simply that there are several occasions between 30 BCE and 66 CE when several successive Arsacid kings make this decision. They decide to send their children to the West, to the court of the emperor in Rome. And the basic question that my book asks and tries to answer is why? Why did this happen? Why did the Parthians do this? And how should we understand these transfers as a kind of moment and as a mediating force in foreign relations between the Roman Empire on one side and Parthian Empire on the other? Any serious attempt to answer that question has to begin with the primary sources that are at our disposal, the kinds of ancient evidence we have, which constitute direct evidence for the lives of these figures, who incidentally I call the Arsacids of Rome, the title of the book. This is what the right-hand column of the table is for, and I know that's going to be an impenetrable haze of abbreviations and numbers, but really the only important thing to take away for our purposes right now is that all of those sources, without exception, are Roman sources. They were composed by inhabitants of the Roman Empire in either Greek or Latin. Most of the evidence is literary. It comes from historiography, so narrative histories of events in the first century CE. And in most cases, those sources are written by the governing classes, the ruling classes of the Roman Empire, the people who are invested with a huge amount of political power within the Roman Mediterranean. And all of those authors thought they knew perfectly well why the Arsacids had been sent to live in the city of Rome. And for them, for these authors, they thought the Arsacids were coming to serve in a capacity that they called hostages, obsides in Latin or homeroi in Greek. Now, it's not a perfect translation for either of those terms. That may conjure up in your mind the notion that, like, the Arsacids are chained in a dungeon somewhere and a dagger is to their throat and someone is waiting to behead them the moment the Parthian Empire makes a misstep. That was not the case. We know of dozens of cases, of hostage taking in Rome. When the hostages come from elite families, especially royal families, they're never put to death. They're never in actual danger of bodily harm. However, in one respect, hostage is a basically fine translation of these terms into English, because part of the Roman logic was this is a sort of form of human collateral to back up an interstate treaty of some kind. These are human guarantees that the surrenderers or the submitters of the hostages will behave in a way that is compliant with Roman wishes, and thus hostages are a sign of Rome's dominance or superiority over the lands that they came from. So that's what our Roman sources say. What have modern scholars made of this idea? Well, there are a few different responses to this in the modern scholarly literature. There are some who simply accept the term hostage without any real problem. They say that this is basically accurate and it accurately reflects the underlying power relationship between the Roman and Parthian empires. Others problematize the translation. They say that they add the kind of qualifications that I just did a moment ago. And then a third set reject the label altogether, and they say it doesn't apply. It's not a useful way to analyze what's going on. But the common thread in all of these scholarly responses is that the Roman sources have always constituted the sole evidentiary basis on which this question has been investigated. And as such, the Roman sources sort of set the line of scrimmage in scholarly debates. They determine what it is we are arguing about. They dictate the relevant social category, namely this category of hostageship. And they ensure that the scholarly literature sort of revolves endlessly around this question of, are these figures hostages or not? Some people may accept that label, others may problematize it, others may reject it, but we're really having a debate which is in the terms, our vocabulary has been set and has been prefigured by the Roman sources. And nothing has really taken the place of those Roman sources on the Parthian side. So the task that I set for myself in the book is to do precisely this sort of job in this intellectual work, to figure out from the Parthian point of view what these exchanges look like and what they meant on the Parthian side. This depends on a method of investigation that previous scholars have not employed. Namely, instead of using the well-worn set of Roman literary texts to investigate this issue, I instead privilege non-Roman sources from the ancient Near East, wherever possible from the lands that the Arsacids themselves actually ruled. And in a moment, I'll take you through what those sources are precisely and what light I think they can shed on the Arsacid vantage point. For now, suffice it to say that on the basis of those sources, I conclude that the operative social institution on the Parthian side, the sort of classification that the Parthians would have given to the Arsacids of Rome, that it was not hostages, but rather foster children. That is, from the Parthian point of view, the princes and other members of the dynasty were going to Rome to live at the emperor's court to become the emperor's foster children. And he, in turn, was to become their foster father. Now, this really matters. This is really significant from the point of view of power relations, because in pre-Islamic Iran, fosterage is a political institution with very distinct connotations for the matter of prestige and hierarchy and rank. Anthropologists who study fosterage cross-culturally in different global cultures around the world distinguish between two kinds of fosterage models, two ways the institution can work in political settings. One of these is called patronal fosterage. This is when a political subordinate sends his or her child sort of up the political and social ladder to be raised by a superior. So superiors raise the children of their inferiors. That's patronal fosterage. The opposite of this is cliental fosterage. And in cliental fosterage, it works the other way around. Political superiors send their children out of their house downward, down the political and social ladder, to grow up with a political subordinate. That's cliental fosterage. The evidence for pre-Islamic Iranian fosterage is necessarily very diverse, but overwhelmingly, it supports the cliental model rather than the patronal one. And it was a very common arrangement for the children of the King of Kings to go out of the royal house to be fostered, usually by aristocratic families who were subordinate to the King of Kings. And so I think you see this direction that this is heading in. The Romans over on their side are saying to themselves, well, the Arsacid king has sent his sons to Rome as hostages. Parthia has accepted Roman superiority. And then meanwhile, over on the Parthian side, the Parthians are saying to themselves, well, the Arsacid king has sent his children to the Roman emperor as foster children. That's a cliental obligation. Rome has accepted Parthian superiority. So the two sides do not agree. There is a divergence in interpretation in how they understand these exchanges, how they understand the transfer of children. And throughout the study, I refer to this divergence as pragmatic misunderstanding. What do I mean by that? Well, misunderstanding, obviously, because the two sides are interpreting the transaction from different cultural vantage points and from the point of view of the social institutions that they know from their own respective cultures. But the misunderstanding is useful, it's expedient, it's pragmatic, it's beneficial to both sides in a way, because by virtue of misunderstanding, each side can walk away from the transfer of children from Parthia to Rome convinced of its dominance, convinced of its supremacy over the other. That's the argument of the book. A few more words about the matter of evidence and the kinds of sources that I use to reconstruct pre-Islamic Iranian fosterage and how it worked. The Parthian Empire, if you're even cursorily familiar with its history, you know that it is really plagued by a serious deficit of especially contemporaneous internal textual sources that permit the study of its history from an internal vantage point. But while there are few internal sources, there aren't none. And so wherever possible, the first category of source I turn to and rely on is epigraphy. So this is writing on rock in most cases, on durable materials, from the territories that the Arsacids actually ruled during the heyday of their empire in Iran. There aren't a lot of these, and on their own, they're really not enough, frankly, to reconstruct the institution of fosterage and how it worked, but several of these inscriptions do attest fosterage relationships. So there's a handful of texts in Parthian from the later period, in Aramaic, and in Greek, which remains an important language from the first day of the Arsacid Empire to its last. The second category is historiography from late antique Armenia. Armenia is a hugely important territory and land for the study of the Arsacids. This is because even after the Arsacids lose their empire in Iran, even after they're sort of booted off the Iranian plateau in Central Asia and Mesopotamia by the Sasanians, who are the following dynasty that replaced them, even then, they maintain control of the kingdom of Armenia for another 2 centuries, all the way until late antiquity. They have power there until 428 CE. This is hugely important because it is precisely in late antique Armenia that we do get the emergence of a different corpus of historiographical sources, literary histories, in the language of Armenian that stand outside of the Roman tradition, that are not written in Greek and in Latin by people who ruled the Roman Empire. It's a textual milieu which is independent of that and is frankly much more indebted to the Iranian sphere than it is to the Roman one. So we have a set of historians from the 4th, 5th, 6th century CE who are either, they either have direct experience of Arsacid rule or they're only a couple of generations removed from it. And fosterage, an institution that in Armenian is called Dayakut Yun, usually translated as noble fosterage, that institution is all over these histories. Third, epigraphy and literature from the Sasanian Empire, the Iranian Empire that took over from the Arsacids after the Arsacids are ousted in 224 CE. We have more abundant evidence both from epigraphy and from literature, mostly in the language of Middle Persian, which is the Iranian language that the Sasanian dynasty spoke. We'll look at a source from this category in just a second. And then fourth and finally, these are very late sources, but still useful in some cases, we have post-conquest literature. So the Arab conquest of the Iranian plateau is the 7th century CE. We have some literature in the, from antiquity's point of view, late language of New or Classical Persian, dates to the 10th, 11th centuries CE, which is useful because we have a couple of poets who write works which, although they are the works of very particular literary talents who lived at this late date, they transmit and retell and encapsulate a series of pre-Islamic historiographical traditions that go back well before the Arab conquest, and in some cases they go back all the way to the Parthian period. For the students who are in classical epic right now, Ferdowsi's Shahnameh is the most important of these sources. There's also a romance called Vis and Ramin, which may have roots in the Parthian period. So that's the sort of evidentiary basis for reconstructing pre-Islamic Iranian fosterage and how it works. Now, I will note that this method is by no means, somehow objectively, in an absolute sense, better than a traditional reliance on Roman historiography. The Roman sources have one major advantage over all of this, and that is they are contemporaneous with the Arsacids of Rome themselves, and they directly describe the lives of those people who all lived in the late 1st century BCE and the early CE. So in some respects, a set of sources which is contemporaneous but external to the culture that you're trying to study, that may be preferable in some ways to this approach, which tries to look for the internal point of view, but in a set of sources, some of which post-date the phenomenon in question by many years. But I submit that as long as the Roman sources, again, remain the sort of sole evidentiary basis on which scholars investigate these kinds of issues, could be the Arsacids of Rome, could be other topics in Parthian history, they will dictate the terms that historians talk about. They will lay down the relevant social categories, in this case, hostageship, and they will prompt scholars to kind of rehash the same set of questions on the basis of similar sources. So this method certainly has drawbacks, but I submit it opens up a new window and a very new perspective on the Arsacids of Rome and who they were and what they meant, at least on the Parthian side. Just to give you a closer look at one of the source categories, Category 3, Sasanian epigraphy and literature, let's go for a moment to southwestern Iran, to the original homeland of the Persians, to the site of Naqsh-i-Rustam, very important royal site throughout the pre-Islamic period, to the inscription of Shapur I. This is the second king of the Sasanian Empire, at the Kabayet Zardusht, which is the square structure you see on the left here, but the site is maybe a little better known for the monumental relief of Shapur, who is the towering and imperious figure that you see on horseback there, best known for his defeat of 3 successive Roman emperors, one of whom he killed, one of whom he took prisoner, and you can see he's grasping one of the emperors by the hand there. That's Valerian, incidentally, the only Roman emperor ever taken alive by a foreign enemy. And then from the 3rd emperor, he extorted an enormous indemnity payment. So very successful career against the Romans, but the portion of his inscription which is useful for fosterage has nothing to do with Rome at all, as a matter of fact. So I give you the Parthian version of the text here. This is from a place in the inscription where Shapur is giving you sort of like a roll call. People who lived under his reign who held rank and influence and prestige and various sorts of political titles. It's a very long list of dignitaries until eventually in section 45, he arrives at a fosterage situation. So here's what he says there. He writes, Sasan, the prince who was brought up or raised in the house of Faragan, and another Sasan, the prince who was brought up in the house of Kadugan. So we have two princes, both named Sasan, both of whom are apparently growing up in a house which was not, properly speaking, their own. It's not, they're not with their natal parents. So what's going on? And what's the political arrangement? We're fairly lucky that early Sasanian epigraphy gives us a relatively clear hierarchy of the ruling classes in the Sasanian period, which can be divided into four groups. At the very top are the kings, the Shardaron, literally the holders of lands. And this would have been, most importantly, the king of kings himself, and then usually his sons, his immediate family, who ruled various client kingdoms under the umbrella of the Sasanian Empire. Under the kings, you get the princes, the Vispuran, members of the ruling dynasty, but a bit more peripheral. So they're sort of, cousins, second cousins once removed, these sorts of more marginal figures within the dynasty. And then in tiers 3 and 4, you have the greater and lesser nobles, the Vuzurgan, literally the big ones, the big guys, and underneath them, the Azadan, the free ones. So those are the greater and lesser houses of the nobility. If we plug in the information that we just got from the Shapur inscription, what do we find? Well, we had, remember, two fostered children, both named Sasan, which is also the name of the dynasty, both at the rank of Vispur, prince. So they pretty clearly belong to tier 2. Meanwhile, we have their foster parents who are raising them, who are bringing them up, who are outside of the house of their natal parents, of course, the Faragan and the Kadugan. We don't know a whole lot else about either of these families. The Faragan are mentioned in one other place. We do know enough to say that they weren't royalty. They were aristocrats, they were powerful, they were an important elite family, but not royalty. And so therefore you have to assign them to either tier 3 or to tier 4. So this is a pretty clear example of a cliental fosterage arrangement, where you have the child of, in this case, the ruling dynasty, being sent downward, down the political and social ladder, to be brought up by, yes, another powerful family, but one that was subordinate to the Sasanian ruling family, which furnished the King of Kings. So it's that kind of evidence which allows me to fill in what this looks like on the Parthian side, and why you can get this fortuitous arrangement where the way the Parthians see things is we are sending our kids to the Roman emperor and thus imposing a cliental obligation on him. We've beaten the Romans, and then the Romans over on their side say, we're getting hostages from the king of Parthia, we've beaten the Parthians. So it's a situation that's characterized by misunderstanding, but what I tried at least to express here is that the understanding creates a kind of balance. There is a certain symmetry, there's an equipoise, a certain harmonizing which can emerge as a result of incomprehension, basically. And from this situation, you get a kind of order emerging. And that, I think, ultimately is a legacy of the Arsacids of Rome, is a kind of order in foreign relations between Rome and Parthia, which emerges from the chaos of misunderstanding and comprehension. That's all from me. Thank you. Rahim, we'll turn it over to you, and I'll just stop the screen share. You're muted still, however.
I should have remained that way happily. So, it was lovely. Thank you so much. It was very brief, Jake. You know, what you have accomplished in this book goes way beyond what you have presented here. There is, it means it's fair to say this is a very important book, and you know how much esteem I have both for your scholarship and the book itself. I can just say that I have been neglecting the Parthian Arsacid history for the last decade. I've not been very interested in it anymore. And your book, for me, has triggered much enthusiasm to engage again with the field. And that is, again, the sign of a good book. Not only is it excellent scholarship, it is animating, invigorating the field. And one is, again, tempted to re-engage. And I thank you for that on a personal level very much, because I like the Arsacids as well. There are many extraordinary points that I have raised in this book. I would just wanted to point out what you have really done here on a number of levels, and also maybe some thoughts for further reflection. I begin with the smaller items and then move my way up to the larger issues. I think the idea that you're presenting, this type of double entendre, that the Parthians or the Arsacid house was looking at these hostages, or at least promoting a certain idea about these hostages that was at the antipodes of the perceptions from the Roman perspective, is excellent. However, as you know, and we have discussed it many times, it's not as if both the so-called patronal and clientele hostage or hostage was unknown to the Arsacids. They themselves are the greatest recipient of princely hostages whom they would foster in their own homeland. You know, we, of course, have debated this issue. We have so many cases, specifically in the astronomical diaries, and also in other inscriptions of the Parthians, the Parthian house, extensively dealing in fostering as hostages princes from lesser kingdoms, be they the Elamians, be they the Armenians, and basically keeping them home. So they were quite aware of what the meaning of these hostages were as hostages, not as hosts. So we cannot assume that they have only one perspective, and that innocent perspective, that when they sent their own sons to Rome, they are meant to be expressing a type of clientele fosterage. And they are basically only considering in their nescience the hostages, I'm saying the sons, to be, to enter into a context of their superiority vis-a-vis Rome, because they have experienced the opposite with others. So they know both sides. They have exercised it both. And that means that they are promoting a different notion of the meaning of fosterage vis-a-vis Rome, which is at the antipode of what they have been exercising hitherto in their own realm and from other sources of which we have access to. And that means that even the Arsacids were able to differentiate between these two aspects, and they were just, in a certain way, not naively seeing the sons there, just thinking that, of course, that would put the Romans in a context of inferiority vis-a-vis them, because that is just the only perspective. No, they knew other perspectives, but they're promoting one vis-a-vis Rome. So that's one of the. Of course, I don't know how you would like us to engage in this, Tony. Do I allow him to speak, or I just go ahead and then he comes back to me in one go?
Well, Jake, what would you like to do?
I'd gladly respond.
Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much, and of course you're quite right. My answer to your point is called Chapter 2, and of course the whole arrangement, as you say, brings out the matter of the importance of perspective. Both the Roman and the Parthian empires were big places. They had many types of people within them. Those people had varying levels of knowledge and awareness about their interlocutors in the other empire. Some Romans and Parthians may not have known of the other's existence at all. Some had some familiarity and awareness of the other, but not much, and were probably at the mercy of the ruling family and the information that it presented and the way it tried to showcase its relations with the other world. Still others may have been in a position to challenge the official party line. So I think we can speak in broad terms of a kind of default Roman view rooted in hostageship, and a default default Parthian view rooted in fosterage. But of course, there could have been, especially other political elites close to the ruling families on either side of the Euphrates River, who were in a position to challenge the dominant narrative. The rulers themselves, of course, knew exactly as you say that there were other ways to parse these kinds of exchanges and these underlying situations. That may have been a narrative that they worried a great deal about controlling, and I think it's reasonable to assume that the Roman emperor, this was a source of concern for him. We can only speculate on the Parthian side, but it's very easy to imagine an upstart member of the nobility saying, you know, you pass this off to us as clientele fosterage, but that's not the only kind of exchange there is out there in the world. And maybe we can imagine a different kind of arrangement, or the Romans are telling the story differently. I think that is entirely possible, and it would be surprising if it didn't happen to some degree. So it underlines, the whole arrangement underlines how much of a matter of perspective and negotiation, the interpretation of interstate affairs is, how polysemous it can be, and how important it is for rulers to control the party line.
Thank you so much. I am indeed aware of chapter 2. Thank you so much. The thing is, what is so extraordinary in this book and makes it quite appealing, and also comes back to the response that you provided, is to make a case for away from the so-called concept of neorealism that has its own merits, to more intangible matters, to bring up the intellectual social exchanges to the fore, and also to provide, at least for a very short period of time, a different concept that would be regulating the exchanges between the inter-imperial exchanges between these two realms, which is indeed, I think, makes by far more sense to me away from the power plays from the realpolitik, because ultimately these two empires have been coexisting for 500, and they are the basis of another coexistence between the Sasanians and Rome. So despite the fact that I'm sure to what some extent neorealism and its concept applies to them, but they have an equilibrium, and that is exactly what you're trying to focus on, albeit maybe for a very short period of time, with this concept, beautiful concept of pragmatic misunderstanding. What I just wanted to bring to the attention of the audience is that the pragmatic understanding, which is your own coinage in a certain way, presumes a certain nescience about the other as a principle of inter-imperial exchanges, rooted in the fact that you only know so much about the other, or at least read in as is necessary for you to cooperate and work. And maybe increasing knowledge of the other actually makes this system collapse. And the vehicle for this inter-imperial exchanges, for your pragmatic misunderstanding, is the hostages, the exchanges of these foster children and the hostages. And I find this really beautiful, and it is really making sense to me. However, what I meant with the Parthians not being naive in this pragmatic misunderstanding is that they very well knew the two sides of how you can interpret hostages or foster children, having themselves exercised this in one way or another on both sides. So there is not total nescience, at least from their perspective, going into that exchange with the Romans. What is also quite interesting to me is, do you have, and that is really a question that I would like to have your vision on, what one wants more from you is to see what can replace the concept of neorealism outside of the pragmatic misunderstandings, which is limited in scope and time to this period of exchanges. Do you have some notions how you would like, maybe on the basis of this book, project a grander scheme upon these exchanges between these two empires? Do you have any vision of how you would like to take it from here?
Thank you. I'm very grateful for that question. And I'd like to think the answer is yes. Just for background, Rahim is referring to what I would say are sort of the reigning, the kind of top book at the moment in the study of ancient interstate relations in the Roman Mediterranean and in the rise of the Parthian Empire, both of which, one is by Arthur Eckstein, a Roman historian, the other by Nicholas Overtomb, a Parthian historian. Both of them employ a theory of international politics called neo-realism, which builds on the realist tradition of analyzing interstate affairs. There's a few components to that theory, but the most important one is that the core condition of international politics is anarchy. That in our domestic lives as citizens, we have all kinds of things that keep order, that keep our lives from becoming a war of all against all. We have the law, maybe less and less. We have kinship. We have shared codes of morality and shared cultural backgrounds. All these things on the domestic level keep our lives from descending into open violence. The point of neorealists is that in interstate politics there are no such forces, there are no such barriers, and there's really nothing to keep order. What I try to show in the book is that despite there being no architect to this situation, where each side is able to walk away convinced it's dominant over the other, a kind of harmony, balance, counterpoise emerges, which creates an order. But it's an order with no arranger. It's sort of a balance without any particular fulcrum. It's what people in the natural and social sciences and in mathematics call an emergent order, something that kind of grows organically out of the interaction of different parts. And that, you know, if there's a general theory of interstate relations at play in the book, it's that in certain kinds of interstate environments, under the right conditions, these kinds of emergent order can simply appear, and they're not the work of any particular architect. They are not the brilliant designs of statesmen. So this may be sort of frustrating or even irrelevant to people whose interest it is to like make policy, because you can't plan this kind of thing. You can't intentionally bring it about. But chaotic systems in math and in the hard sciences can sometimes produce these moments of emergent order. And I think that can be reasonably assumed in the case of interstate affairs as well. It's not something humans can control, but it's something human beings can interpret and see, in many cases in hindsight, because it's sort of a script that operates above the immediate understanding of any of the actors who are involved in it. So yeah, if there's a larger theoretical approach to the topic, Rahim, I think it's in that point.
Finally, the last point I wanted to raise, if I may, and that is a comparable issue that I've encountered while dealing with the Achaemenids most recently, and that is to what extent we have basically no idea about the cosmography and about the way that they imagine their own Umwelt, so to say. How do they imagine their own topography, their own geography, and with this come, of course, a notion of cosmography. Of course, this matter is even more complicated with the Parthians, but I just wanted to provide a few hints at where I'm going here. When the early Parthian state is being attacked by the Seleucids, by, among others, Antiochus Sidetes, we know that the Parthians are able to withdraw from Mesopotamia and basically challenge the Romans away from Hyrcania, basically removing themselves and the states in an itinerant fashion away from the melee that was Mesopotamia under attack by the Seleucids. Time and again, we see the same phenomenon on the Romans attacking the Ctesiphon, one of the cities regie of the Parthians, and then withdrawing into the steppes, so to say. And then you have the idea of sending the hostages to Rome in a certain way. So before going to that, one has the impression that the capital city, Ctesiphon, is time and again being sacrificed as a bait to either the Seleucids or Roman invasions in order to satisfy them. It's just like a big dessert that you cannot digest right away. And then eventually they will, they would suffocate from that richness of serving. And then the idea arises, what is the function of these hostages beyond what you have so well established and seen? Is that really a bait to appease Romans as well? Is it something you sent in the heart of the opponent empire to actually let them digest this rich serving while you are buying time, while you're actually protecting your periphery in a certain way, so that the heart of the realm is untouched? And that what I just described to you can work really well with the Iranian cosmogony, and that you see throughout. Despite the fact that you cannot say whether the Arsacids are Mazdeans or not, whether they believe in the Mazdean notion of cosmogony, but the same idea is at the heart of how the Iranian empires of the past, be it the Achaemenids and the later Sasanians, have viewed the others, basically the main aggressors, namely as an aggressor whom you have eventually to appease in order to preserve the realm. And to me, this evasive nature of the Parthians sacrificing time and again one of the capitals, Ctesiphon, and sending, at least during that period that you described, royal princes to Rome, maybe as an act of appeasement, seems to be very much entangled with this notion of cosmography and cosmogony I was referring to, namely sending as a bait, sacrificing your sons so that the other is appeased and can actually call it a momentary triumph while preserving the realm. Do you have any thoughts about that?
I like the idea very much. It's very appealing. And so two thoughts occur. One is that the late first century BCE and the first CE, these are periods when the Romans are not yet marching on Ctesiphon. They have no forays that are so deep into Parthian territory yet. And it may be significant, as your comment was suggesting, that there's one way to keep order and order doesn't have to mean peace necessarily, but in the earlier period, the way of keeping order, the way of establishing a sort of rough status quo, is through the sending of these children in whatever capacity, as hostages, as foster children, as bait, or whatever. And once that conduit dies out, and it does die out, it really, at the end of the Julio-Claudian period, this phenomenon ends. And a few decades later, we see the beginning of the pattern that you are describing, where the Romans mount serious invasions of Parthian territory. They advance into southern Mesopotamia. They take the Parthian quote-unquote capital for all the good it does them. And of course, that continues into the Sasanian period as well. So yeah, I like very much the idea that in an earlier period, they do it one way, and then in the later, they do it another. And the final thought I'll add on this point is simply that sacrificing the son, this may or may not, we cannot know anything, of course, about how the Arsacid kings felt while doing this. They may have sent their children off to Rome with a feeling of dread and foreboding in their stomachs, sick to their stomach at having to part with their treasured children. They may also have sent their children off, dusted their hands and said, good riddance, that kid was a real danger to my reign anyway, and I really needed a reason to get him out. One ancient text which says exactly this, independent of the Roman and Parthian milieu, I talk about it in the book a bit, is the Arthashastra, which is a kind of statecraft manual from ancient India. There's a passage in there that says you should try to trick your enemy into giving a traitorous kid or a traitorous minister as a hostage, because then you kill two birds with one stone. You get the dangerous person away from your realm of domestic politics, and you appease the foreign enemy at the same time. So you can do multiple things. You can kill multiple birds with a single stone by using these kinds of stratagems.
I think you're absolutely right, I just agree with your assessment on this. I think, however, that the Arsacids sending their sons there knew quite well that there would be no danger to them because they would not be accepted back home. And there is no single case, despite Parthian nobility's time and again, requesting the return that any of would have been successful. So it's basically appeasing without running any real danger of them ever becoming a threat to them and a client puppet of the Roman Empire. But what I meant is you can maybe combine the hostage, well, what I use, this fosterage policy of the Arsacids in the earlier period with the later periods, basically evading direct confrontation with the Romans and sacrificing the capital. There might be the same mindset might be at the heart of both, as you just so well put it.
Yes.
I
Thank you
think
so
I
much.
have spoken way too much, dear Tony, and it might be time maybe to open it to the audiences to have more clever thoughts expressed here than I was able to express.
No, that was wonderful. Thank you so much, Professor Shayegan. I'm so glad to have you here. Wonderful, excellent, provocative comments. Yes, we will open this up. I know we have some questions online, but let's start with the room here. If there's someone.
Yeah, I mean, I can't wait to read the book. I have two questions. One comes out of Rahim's, I think, second question about sort of how representative is this emergent order of pragmatic misunderstanding of Roman-Parthian relations more broadly, perhaps, right? So I'm thinking of the exchange of Crassus's standards, for example, right? Which Augustus appears to present as a military victory, but really was a negotiation. Is there an element of pragmatic misunderstanding there too that sort of both sides benefit from? So that's the one question. The other one is like the place where I would see the pragmatic misunderstanding potentially breaking down is in the lived experience of these hostages / foster children, right? Who are like, wait, I'm supposed to be like the whatever the valued sort of this is supposed to be, what was it, cliental and not patronal, and yet they're treating me like some fool here, right? And so I was wondering, is there, I mean, they may never go back, right? So they're in no position to tell anyone, perhaps. But do you see any signs that the Romans perhaps accommodate, like went a little bit out of their way to accommodate this misreading? So I'm thinking of the Arsacids, for example, where these hostages are famously like depicted as children, which suggests a fosterage relationship precisely, right? And you could have just left them out too, right? But you're absolutely. I mean, so are there ways in which the pragmatic misunderstanding is deliberate misunderstanding, where like there are these structures put in place that allow for the misreading to occur sort of deliberately?
Yeah, those are great questions. Thank you so much. On the first point, the sort of scholarship I'm responding to, which makes use of this theory, Neorealism's account of how things play out in the interstate arena is all about material stuff. How many soldiers do you have? How much territory do you have? What's your economic productivity? These are all things in the world. And I think if you want to interpret Roman-Parthian relations from that vantage point, one of the great unsolved questions is, what are Parthia's material capabilities? Depending on who you ask, the Parthian army was 30,000 troops or 300,000 troops. That's like, on the Roman side, we have a pretty good idea, half a million men or so. We have a good data point there. We just don't know these things on the Parthian side. So we really need a better sense of that. Are there other ways, perhaps with the exchange of the standards and the prisoners also from the Battle of Carrhae, where reputation played a role in Roman-Parthian relations, and the Parthians kind of avoided a Roman invasion by making this token concession of, sure, we'll give you your POWs back and we'll give you the standards back. We know those are really important to you. Yeah, I think absolutely. But whether that produces a kind of long-term equilibrium like this does over the course of 100 years, that's just one individual moment in time. But of course, they can add up to something serious. Do the Romans show any signs of either cognizance or accommodation of the kind of fosterage dimension? I think the answer is yes. It's really interesting that the sources produced by the emperors themselves, really emperor Augustus. So we have the Arapakis and we have the Res Gestae. Those are the far less jingoistic and sort of chest thumping sources about, oh, Rome has dominated Parthia or whatever. I think Augustus could kind of rely pretty confidently on the senatorial classes, beating the drum in this regard. And it's really in the senatorial sources, and people sort of at a couple of removes from the emperor, where we find this kind of very confident, we took hostages from them, we're better than them, that kind of view represented. The Arapakis is one piece of Roman media where arguably Augustus is showing a different understanding, or maybe is meeting the Parthians halfway. And another place where eventually you see it emerge in only a couple of Roman sources, some of them do say things like, yes, they sent us hostages, but they were just trying to rid themselves of potentially problematic people. That kind of suggests that, like, they know there's something else going on the Parthian side. They have ulterior motives, something more than just simply bowing down to the Roman Empire, but they don't know the institution that the Parthians are using to describe the transaction. So they get that there's a bigger story, and that there's another perspective out there which is not so kind of jingoistic as a lot of the Roman authors are. But they don't know quite how to put it, and all they can say is, like, that there was something fishy going on, but that's where they stop. They go no further than that. So in some sources of evidence, yeah, you see the kind of thing that you're alluding to. Thank you so much.
I'm just going to ask, do you think the Parthians and the Romans saw this as an exclusively political exchange between the two, and not as a maybe form of cultural exchange or some other aspect of life? Do you think they saw this as sort of exclusively political?
No, I mean, I think the Romans understand, if nothing else, they understand that bringing these people who were sort of like foreign curiosities to the city of Rome, yes, it introduces to a very limited degree, new practices, new languages, or whatever to the city's urban landscape. But is that ultimately non-political? I think for political reasons they like this very much, because it kind of aided this Roman impression that Rome is caput orbis, Rome is the head of the world, and by sort of managing in microcosm the various peoples and in some cases plants and animals of the wider world within the city of Rome, you really just showed the kind of universal reach of Roman power. So I don't think there's any sort of consideration of these figures that's like purely independent of politics. I wouldn't say so, but they certainly acknowledge and are attuned to the fact that these people represent a very different cultural tradition from a part of the world that, from the Roman point of view, is sort of unthinkably remote from Italy. And the thing is, though, that's politically useful to the emperors at the end of the day. So cultural dimension, absolutely, but purely cultural, don't know that I would say so.
Rebecca.
The question is, I'm very intrigued by the practice of clientele fosterage. I mean, with the other form, the patronal fosterage benefits of, as a king of kings, sending your children to the house of your subject to raise up. I'm just very intrigued by that.
If it's a kid you actually like, you can insulate them from the pressures of dynastic politics. It's a very serious motive. This is like one of the most brutal kinds of kinship units you can be a part of, and it may have genuinely been a kind of relief valve from some of those pressures. But more importantly, it's a kind of motive interface between the king and usually the aristocratic families on whom the king depends. The king, by sending them a child, is giving them something very precious and valuable, because from the point of view of that aristocratic family, if you play your cards right and if the stars align in the right way, your foster kid is going to become the king of kings, and that gives you access to a height of political power that you didn't enjoy before. So it's a two-way street. Like there's something in it for the families, and what the kings get out of it is making these very powerful aristocratic clans accept their rule, buy into the system, and maybe relieve some of the pressures of dynastic politics at the same time. So it's really a vital mechanism of political communication and empire building in a way. This is one reason at least why it's such a permanent and enduring feature of pre-Islamic Iranian history.
May I say something here further to what dear Jake was saying, if I may? There is something also very interesting with respect to what the placement of these kids, these foster children in the noble families. I think we have to assume that some of them are, of course, next of kin, and mostly the families on the maternal side. So from later Pahlavi sources, these are Middle Persian sources of the Sasanian area that were composed later on. We know that, like in medieval France or other continental medieval kingdoms, often cases the recipient of the foster children might have been next of kin on the maternal side. And the uncle would play basically the role of a substitute father, an ersatz father, and also allow, of course, to rally these powerful families. And I agree with you that there must be grandees, they must be belonging to the Wuzurg categories, would be rallying to the cause of that prince who is in competition with other princes.
Thank you. Now think about it, we have all the evidence from ancient Egypt where you have high royal officials appointed as royal nurse. They're not actually like changing diapers for princesses, but they're actually giving them education. And some of their children who grew up with these future kings as their foster siblings, and that could, foster kind of bond of connection and trust between future rulers and future high officials, which is very beneficial. My other comment is you label this exchange of hostage, but sending of Parthian princes to Rome as a pragmatic misunderstanding. We might have another example from ancient Egypt, where in the New Kingdom period, pharaohs would take princesses from other great powers, engineers and great powers, and to the Egyptian courts. And from the engineers' perspective, giving your daughters to your subjects is a way to express your own sovereignty. And from the Egyptian perspective, they're not giving. So from the engineers' perspective, they're giving out their daughters to establish real blood ties between royal families. So the future ruler will have some of their, be their king. It's a great way to establish long-term relationship with each other. But from the Egyptian perspective, they never, with probably two exceptions, they never allow these princesses to assume the title of chief royal wife. And we have little evidence that their children actually, assume the crown of a king. So from their perspective, these foreign kings, though they deal with them on an equal basis in diplomatic letters, they can advertise to their internal audience, domestic audience, we're taking these as minor secondary wives, concubines. Is our way expressing their sovereignty, and they are, everyone else is inferior to the Egyptian pharaoh. So in a way, that's also a happy coincidence. Not necessarily saying that the two sides don't know how the other partner, diplomatic partner, is advertising these domestically, but they're having to make minor concessions because they use different communication strategies to different audiences.
Yeah, on the first point you make about marriages, Samuel Meyer in that chapter in the Amarna Letters edited volume, makes basically this point, and it's a very similar kind of dynamic where the Egyptians see it as a patronal thing. Everyone else sees it as a cliental thing. And Meyer makes a great point there as well, which is, they may have been aware that the interlocutor saw things differently, but from their point of view, that was an inferior way of seeing it. And so you paper over these things. This is not something you like press your interlocutor down and say, we have to get down to brass tacks here and figure out what this actually means. Why would you do that if it's not in your political advantage to do so? So really useful piece. And then on on the kind of backroom double dealing, I think an Amarna letter that we've talked about is the first one, EA1, where you get a letter from the Kassite king to the pharaoh asking, look, can you just send me a wife? I get it, you don't want to send your actual daughter to me to get married. Well, just send me any woman, and that's fine. I'll just marry her, and my subjects will think that I'm married to an actual Egyptian princess. I think that's such an interesting piece of correspondence. Sadly, in the context of Roman-Parthian relations, we don't have evidence like that. We have some evidence for epistolary exchanges between the king and the emperor, but only in Roman literary sources that we really can't trust to be like literal transmitters of documents. So that's a really interesting way to think about if they did exchange letters, what was going on in those letters? Very possibly something along the same lines as that particular Amarna letter.
Could you check online? Because there are a bunch of questions.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you. Or shall I? I thought it was here.
But if anyone had a follow-up,
Be to wait if for the Q&A is.
We have a bunch.
let's see. I could take, I think it was here. Mostly fascinating. I'll take Lee's question.
Okay.
Sure.
Enormously fascinating. This is from Lee Patterson. There is an interesting angle regarding the 4 hostages that Augustus received, not symbols of submission as the emperor claimed, but rather Tacitus and Strabo suggested Phraates wanted his sons removed from the Arsacid political scene to forestall their use in any attempted coup, or according to Josephus, his consort Musa convinced him to do so to protect the royal claims of their son. Could that dynamic have been in play, at least in that case?
Thanks very much, Lee, for coming and for your great question. And yeah, that's the kind of literary passage I was alluding to a moment ago in response to Matthias's question that do you see signs of understanding and maybe even accommodation in Roman sources? Strabo is not a policymaker. He's not someone who is figuring out how to conduct Roman-Parthian relations or anything. But I do think in that passage you get a flicker of understanding that on the Parthian side that there are ulterior motives. There are other things going on than the mere desire to scrape and bow to Roman supremacy. Why Strabo is such an interesting source is that in a different passage discussing the exact same transfer of the exact same children, he says, well, the Parthians are just doing this out of obsequiousness and the desire to kowtow. So to his mind, clearly these must not have been mutually exclusive explanations. The desire to submit to Rome on the one hand, but the desire to purge one's domestic politics of troublesome potential rebels on the other hand. These must have been compatible things. Michael and then Chris.
So you talked about the vocabulary of hostages in the Greek and Roman sources, and I'm curious about the corresponding vocabulary of fostering in the non-Roman sources and the connotations of that vocabulary. And is there any sense that something more than just a child is being fostered? Any sense of fostering like political utility or advantage along with the child themselves?
Yes. So the terminology on the Near Eastern side, the word for foster father or noble fosterer in Middle Persian is doyag, and this is very revealing. In modern Persian, doye means nurse, and especially wet nurse, someone who provides nourishment for a child through breastfeeding. It could have that meaning in Middle Persian and in Armenian. It also ends up in Armenian. It's a loan word through Iranian there. It's a very similar situation to what you see on the Roman side. The Roman word for fosterer is altor, which comes from allo, to nourish. So the vocabulary comes from sort of parental care, and that's where it comes from. We actually don't have a good sense of what the word for foster child would have been in Iranian languages. In Armenian, we know it was san, but that there may be some kind of contamination and pollution there from the realm of Christian godparentage, which is a relatively late arrival in terms of the period under survey in this study. So my sense is the most likely answer is that they're simply sons, and there's there's a very revealing phrase in one text that one ruler received a child into his house literally for sonship, for childship, for the purpose of childship, i.e., for the purpose of being his child. And so I think it's simply it's a very real kinship. It's a kind of kinship relation that the person you rear in your house is a son in the same way that a natal son is. That's my sense, although it's somewhat speculative given the relative poverty of the textual evidence on the Iranian side. But at any rate, Dayag as wet nurse, but also applied by extension to male fosterers, Altor follows basically the same trajectory on the Roman side.
You wanted Christopher or Charlotte? Hi, Charlotte.
Yeah, just a really general question about this, this IR theory background. And so, I mean, as I understand it, this is an asymmetric relation. The hostages or foster children are only going west. There's only Parthian one.
Well, that's right. Yeah,
that's right. And so, would you say that that an asymmetric relationship is going to be, as it were, predicted? That is for the sake of stability at this, between major state players. Though it might seem, it might be nice for them to see each other as equal participants on the world stage. Actually, that's gonna be rather unstable. What will be more stable is for each to see itself as the dominant party to relative to the other. And so then
right.
if that were the case, then that would predict these asymmetric relations, because the asymmetric relations, rather than sending hostages back and forth, which make it easier for each side to see themselves as getting the better end of the stick.
Yeah. Well, it's hard to say because we can't go back in time and sort of run the experiment a different way and see how it played out. But one thing we can do is we can go to the end of the period when they stop exchanging these children, they stop going back and forth, and ask, did things get any better at that point in time? Were they prompted once understanding perhaps they had more experience with one another and understanding could take root a bit more deeply? Did things improve, and was the conduit expanded or did it contract? The answer is it contracted. So presumably if they had more information at an earlier date, it would not have produced equilibrium or order. And again, I want to stress that order is not necessarily the same thing as peace, because you can still fight wars, you can still find reasons to go to war, but war takes place kind of within a framework. It has rules that structure the competition of war. And at the end of a war, you can have another round of hostages or foster children, and the equilibrium can kind of reassert itself. So yeah, I am skeptical that, and I think one paradoxical finding of the book is that more understanding led to worse political outcomes in a way. Again, that's not very useful to policymakers, but it does show that the realm of interstate affairs is really complex and can produce these kinds of incidental situations, which may be beneficial for both parties, but that may fall apart at the slightest provocation or when political circumstances move on.
This is a very invigorating discussion. So let's take some more questions here. Charlotte Howley asks, I was wondering how much you dive into how these foster children were viewed in the Parthian sphere. Do you think that their childhood in the Roman system affects their ability to project royal legitimacy as adults? She's thinking of the rejection of Arsacids V and Musa by the Parthian nobles in favor of Orodes III, which does seem to indicate a certain rejection. But in the Sasanian context, Khosrau II's fosterage at the Byzantine court of Maurice seemingly did not impact the ability to rule.
Thank you so much, Charlotte. Great question. Well, yeah, I mean, chapters 4 and 5 are about the few cases where they go back, and in some cases they do go back, as you allude to, and probably at the end of the day, their Roman upbringing is a serious handicap. It's really, really tough to say anything with confidence about this because our sources of information about the quote unquote hostages that go back are these Roman sources who tell us that the Arsacids of Rome are rejected by the Parthians for being kind of acculturated creatures of the Romans, and they'd sunk down into a sort of state of slave-like subjection in the city of Rome. This is the way that Tacitus puts it. Tacitus, of course, is not really an unproblematic source for that kind of statement. Tacitus is always looking for a stick to beat the emperors with, and so if he can say that a Parthian former hostage didn't succeed in his homeland because Tiberius was a bad influence on him, or he picked up bad habits from Claudius, that's exactly what he's going to do and what he's going to say. However, we really do get the impression it's consistent enough that ultimately the Parthians do kind of reject the ones that go back. One becomes king, but it doesn't last for very long, and so the brand really seems to have been tainted. And also pursuant to what Chris was asking, I think this is one reason why the arrangement kind of dries up in the end. It's that for members of the Parthian nobility back in Parthia who are looking around for a new Arsacid to make king, the ones in Rome are kind of tainted. They have a really bad track record of becoming king in Parthia and remaining in that office. So eventually they stop asking and they just stay in Rome. And this, I think, is part of why the arrangement ultimately falls apart at the end of the day.
So
maybe one more.
One more?
Yeah.
We have Michael from Penn State, John Hyland, and Raymond Bally and James Scherer. Any?
Let's see. Well, John asks, congratulations. Other princely hostages, so Agrippa in Rome. So John asks about other hostages, like the Herodians in Rome, how their presence would have played into Roman perceptions of their Arsacid guests. Would the Romans have distinguished the Arsacids of Rome from other hostages or associated them with others? Yeah, that's a great question, John. I think we find the sentiment expressed pretty reliably and consistently in Roman literary sources that the Parthians are an exceptional foreign power, which I think must have been right in kind of material and objective terms. The Parthians, very often they're described as like the other great empire with whom Rome shares the earth. They're described in one source as the antipoloi of the Romans, the antagonist. It's a wrestling term. It's like the opponent that you face off with in wrestling. So Romans knew that, yeah, this was an exceptionally big, exceptionally powerful, and exceptionally well-organized kingdom that really was a serious rival to Rome, that Rome never really managed to bring entirely under its sway. And followers of foreign affairs knew this and understood it, and so would not have regarded the Arsacids as sort of a piece with the Herodians. Whether the Roman public at large would have come to that conclusion, very possibly not. And I think one thing that Augustus and Caligula and Nero, one thing they sort of hope for when they exhibit their Arsacids to the Roman public, as they do many times, is that the Romans kind of take them as cut from the same cloth as the Herodians or German hostages who are in the city of Rome, or various hostages from other lands of the Roman Empire. If you can make the case that the Parthians are basically the same thing as them, it just redounds to your own glory and self-regard all the more.
Do people need to get to their classes at Penn State? Shall we take this? Okay.
Rahim, thank you so much again for joining us.
I just wanted to say one final word about this book before you release me, and because I think it's important for people to know. And that is, this is an extraordinarily important book that is going to trigger a lot of conversation and discussion, that is marked by two marked turns away from the realia of power politics towards more intangible items of social and intellectual exchanges. That is extraordinarily important, a shift. And the second one is to identify misunderstanding as a begetter of order. This is really huge. Means it is limited in scope, temporal scope, but to really understand nescience, misunderstanding as a begetter of order and equilibrium between empires, this is huge to me. And I think it will beget a lot of discussions, a lot of conversation, invigorating the field, and for which I thank you so much, Jade. Thank you.
Thank you, Rahim. I hope so.
Thank you so much for having us. Wonderful. Congratulations again on this great book. And thank you everyone for attending. Thank you for people online. Jake saw your questions and maybe he can follow up with some people.
Surely will, yeah.
Sorry we did not get to all of them, but thanks everyone. Thanks, Jake. Wonderful. Congratulations. And thanks again, Professor Shayegan.
Thank you, Professor Holm. Thank you.
Care.
Thank you. Take care.